Carlos in the Bronx, borrowing from a question that I saw on Twitter, what was the first big wrestling scoop that you heard or read about? Mine was that Hogan, Hall, and Nash were coming back to the WWE as the NWO. What was yours? The first scoop I ever heard, I think I've told this story on the show before, but we always have new listeners. The first scoop I ever heard was way back in 1992. It was January of 92 to be exact. I was at school. It was lunch or recess or whatever it was. And there was a phone booth in the school. Not even sure why, but there was a phone booth in the school. And I should actually probably explain what that even is, because there's probably people listening to this podcast who have no idea what a phone booth is, which is kind of scary and makes me feel very old. But yes, there are these things that still do exist, believe it or not. I still see them in the city, called phone booths, which is exactly what it sounds like. It is a booth that has a telephone that you can use, and you can put a quarter in the slot and make a call, or you can make a collect call, which is probably something else that maybe some people don't know what that is. And I'm going to stop now because I'm getting very depressed. But there was a phone booth in the school, and I could not figure out why. There were a bunch of kids and a bunch of friends of mine who were all huddled around this phone booth. And I was curious, obviously, and so I walked over to see what the hell was going on. And as I was walking over, they were ending the call, and so they hung up. But I heard one kid turn to the other, and I remember actually the kid's name. I won't say it in case somebody listening actually knows who he is, but he turned to one of the other students and said that Ric Flair is going to win the Royal Rumble. And he had called, obviously, one of those old wrestling hotlines. It was probably the old Blackjack Brown hotline that he used to advertise in the New York Daily News. So I knew who was going to win the Royal Rumble in 92 before it even happened. The greatest Royal Rumble of all time. 27 years ago yesterday, in fact, was the anniversary of that Royal Rumble. So when it came time for me to go to my grandparents' house to watch the pay-per-view, because we didn't have cable, my family didn't have cable until 95. So all the cable stuff that I would watch, they would either have to tape it for me, or it would be on the weekends when I would be over there, and he would have WCW Saturday Night on, and I was always, downtrodden because I was a hardcore WWF guy. I didn't give two shits about WCW Saturday Night, but I would watch anyway. Of course, now I look back and I long for those days. But anyway, so I went over to their house for the pay-per-view, and I remember saying, Ric Flair is going to win the Royal Rumble. And when he came out at number 3, I vaguely remember someone laughing. I don't know if it was my father or my grandfather. Well, they weren't laughing when that match was over, but I was. I felt like a rock star. And it was my very first exposure in 92 to the wrestling hotlines. I didn't call them very often, myself. Like the night of the 1994 King of the Ring, I caved. I called the WWF hotline. I don't remember why I called. I called the WWF hotline number the night of the King of the Ring in 94. And that was just a waste of money. I called a hotline the day of the Bad Blood pay-per-view in 97 because I was at Disney World on a family vacation. The one and only time I've ever been to Disney. And I was pissed, too, because it was the day of a this vacation fell on the weekend of the Bad Blood pay-per-view. And this is back when, in my younger days, when I was completely psychotic. And if there was some kind of a glitch, if the pay-per-view was supposed to come on at 8 o'clock and there was some kind of a problem and it didn't come on right away, I would have a meltdown. And I would call the cable company and I'd be just yelling and ripping into them. And I couldn't miss a minute. Like back then, this was like, everything was must-see if you were a younger fan back then. Now, I could give two shits, but back then it was like, no, I couldn't miss a minute of the action. So I was pissed because I was going to miss the whole pay-per-view because, we weren't going to get home for a couple more days. And so I had a hotline that I would call for news on occasion, and I remember calling the hotline and was shocked to find out that Brian Pillman was dead. I called from a hotel room in Florida to find out that Pillman had died in a hotel room in Minnesota. So that was a very unique experience. That kind of put a damper on the on my birthday that year, the rest of our vacation. Let's see, who else? I don't know how many of you remember Sushi X. Maybe some of you do. There was a guy named Sushi X. He had a free hotline I used to call for news, and I think he had an email newsletter as well, possibly. In fact, I found out last year that he follows me on Twitter, which was great because I didn't even know he was still alive. I didn't know he was still around. We kind of reconnected. I told him, hey, I used to subscribe to your stuff. It was like needle in a haystack type shit. So that was him. And by the way, this could be a fun question to put to all of you guys. Like, what were your earliest sources of wrestling news? Because I know the people who listen to this show, the age range, I mean, just runs the gamut. So there's going to be a lot of younger people who probably say, SE Scoops or 411 or, Lords of Pain. And Lords of Pain was back even in the late 90s as well, although I didn't go there too often. But it's a great question to pose to everybody listening. What were your go-tos? Because my go-tos in the mid-90s were Sushi X. There was Mikasa or Mikasa, however you pronounce that fucker's name. It's too hard. Vince McMahon should change it. Just call him Big Cass then. But yeah, like Mikasa was another one. And the Slammer, Peter Scaretta, who ran an email newsletter called The Mat Rap. He now runs a movie news website called Slash Film. But way back in the day, he had his own wrestling newsletter, and I don't know what his subscriber base was, but I was on the list, and that's how I got a lot of my news. Now, I'm sure he just pulled a lot of it from the Observer and the Torch. That's where much of it came from. But not everybody had a subscription to the Observer and the Torch back then. I didn't. This is how people got their news, starting in the mid to late 90s. So today it's podcasts. There's probably a decent number of people listening to this right now who get their news from this show. Or other podcasters, or other YouTubers. We're long past the days of the hotlines. Those hotlines, they're pretty much, for the most part, they're pretty much dead and buried. So now it's all on the internet, and you have the newsletters are still around, but we're kind of in the era now, I think, of the podcast. We're in the podcast era. So we are now what the hotlines were 20 years ago. And 20 years from now, it might be something completely different. But yeah, chime in and let me know. I'll put this up on YouTube also. Curious how far back some of you guys go and what your earliest sources of news were.